This is the Convergent Science Network podcast. Leading researchers in the domain of neuroscience, brain theory, and technology are interviewed by Paul Verschure and Tony Prescott.
So, this is Paul Verschure for the Convergent Science Network podcast. And we're here at the Barcelona Cognition, Brain and Technology Summer School of 2018. And as one of our speakers today, we have Encarni Marcos.
Hello.
And Encarni, so you were talking about two things. Like you emphasized very much this whole idea of how prefrontal cortex represents the memory of goals and initiates actions, right? So, what do you see as sort of the key feature of these neurons that needs to be explained?
I think the most important result or the most important thing that we have seen in our data is that the neural network in prefrontal cortex is really heterogeneous. So you cannot explain anything just by looking at the average firing rate of the population because you have nothing there. You have really to go inside the individual dynamics to be able to see something and to really understand what is going on there.
Right. So, so what are the key observations that you then start out from in this exploration?
So one of the key results is that we found that there are some neurons or some group of neurons in the prefrontal cortex which really play an important role in shaping the whole dynamics of the network.
Mm-hmm.
And these neurons are so important because they are very susceptible to the input so that they change state very easily. And that, consequently, they can shape the whole network activity, and we can be flexible about what we do or how we interact with the world. Well, at the same time, we have neurons which are much more stable, so that they keep track of what we did and which is our internal state or all information that could be relevant for what we are doing.
Right. But so one of the first experiments that you discussed was actually an interesting one where you looked at how neurons responded to the feedback that the animal received after it performed the task, correctly or incorrectly, right? And you showed that if you measure from dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, neurons came actually in two flavors, right? That some showed an elevated response and others actually did not change the response level after the feedback was received. But what was curious there is that you showed that these neurons increase their response. So I initiate a movement, I get my feedback, I make an error, and there were neurons that actually elevated their response when an error was made, right? As opposed to neurons that actually did not change at all in case the response was correct. Right? So this was a little bit the starting point to show that there is some sort of an internal memory system at work, but it elevates the response when I make a mistake. So what's the significance of that?
Well, in the task in which we did the analysis, actually we saw also that it was not really relevant there because the monkeys didn't use that information at all in their subsequent behavior. But we think that this might be very important in dynamic environments or in situations in which you have to be flexible actually to adapt to changes. So you need to know if you did well or not, because that could have an influence in your subsequent behavior. Mm-hmm. So we think that the prefrontal neurons are anyway monitoring this information in case there are some changes or in case this could be relevant for something else later on.
Okay, but in this case, this elevated response in the firing rate to an error trap, it might not be of immediate relevance in that task because you're not controlling in any way error, right? But could you still argue that maybe for other mnemonic functions, this error function might play a role in some other process that is not directly translated to task performance? Or would you really say irrelevant? Like this is irrelevant?
No. I say irrelevant for what we looked at. I don't think it's irrelevant for everything. So I think if prefrontal cortex or the brain in general is monitoring its information or keeping track of that, is because it might be useful at some point.
Mm-hmm.
For this task in particular, we didn't find any correlation between correct and the motivation of behavior. But it could be relevant if in the same task we change some unexpectedly we change something of the task. Then the monkey would use this information to learning and adaptation. So it's not irrelevant in general, but it's maybe the word was not well used. It's not irrelevant for everything, but it's not relevant in the way the monkey is using that information in that task. But it doesn't mean that it's irrelevant.
Right. But so what was interesting as well is that usually there's an interpretation that feedback to the animal and error is translated to some sort of modulatory signal to prefrontal cortex, right? Where you would say, well, I got an unexpected reward, dopamine goes up transiently, and I should see some change in the response. I have an unexpected error, and I should see a transient downregulation of dopamine, which should also be translating to a transient response change in the neurons. Mm-hmm. But in some sense, you see something very different now, right? Because we see here now that an error translates into an increased response, which would be associated with, let's say, release of dopamine. But that doesn't make sense given the standard model. The standard model says, no, an unexpected error should be a reduction in dopamine response, right? So do you, from that perspective of how I've been thinking about how error regulates prefrontal cortical responses, is this a surprising outcome, or you think it's really sort of fits in the standard interpretation of how the system should work?
For us, it was at the first step, it was surprising. We were not expecting that the activity would increase for the trials, but as you said, we would expect it to increase if there is a dopamine release, we should expect it to increase with the reward delivery. But we found actually the opposite. We found it, we tried to find some kind of correlation actually between the error and the difficulty of the trial, to say, okay, do we have some correlation in the way that maybe for more difficult trials, you don't have this activation in the neurons because you were just expected to be wrong, so you just have nothing. But for the easiest trials, for some reason that we cannot really explain yet, you have this activation because in some point it's like, hey, look, this was wrong, and I was not expecting that. But we don't speculate yet because we cannot answer that in which are the mechanisms causing this. But actually, we didn't find either this correlation with difficulty. So we could not explain that in that way. So, it was a surprising result. And from what we have now, we cannot go more into the details of that.
But is it fair to say that it questions the standard model? Or do you believe it will be incorporated in the standard model if you just have a bit more time to look at the details of this?
I think this should be incorporated into the standard model. I don't think it's against the standard model. I think this is some feature that should be taken into account.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So now we know that we have responses at different time scales. We have very systematic responses even after the action has been emitted, after we've received our feedback. In this case, then relates to the error component. But then in some sense, you were delving much more in detail in that. And you started to look at, okay, how does the response of these prefrontal cortical neurons, if a simple discrimination task, right? I have to say whether something is closer or further away, or whether the time interval is short or long, what's a simple discrimination test. You started to see that these memory-based responses of these neurons were actually not univariate. It was not that they were just reflecting one property of the task, right? They could also switch, if you want, their response properties. Mm-hmm. So what's really the implication of that? So how dramatic is that? This switching of the response properties.
You mean from coding something in memory to coding something else afterwards?
Yeah.
How dramatic.
So this was the experiment that you published in scientific reports. And 2016, if I'm correct. Was it 16? Yes. So where you show these persistent activities in prefrontal cortex are not committed. If you look at a single cell, it's not that the single cell has high fidelity to one property of the task, right? It might initially maybe code for what the goal is of the task, but at some point it just switches its allegiance and it starts to code something else. It starts to go in the action you want to transmit, right? So how fundamental is that property, this ability to switch? Do you see that in many of these neurons, or is it something that is sort of very, very rare?
No, actually, this is quite common in prefrontal neurons. So they are not just tuned to one of the properties of the task, but normally they code. The normal thing is that they represent more than one feature of the task. So it's quite common to find that in the prefrontal cortex.
But they code one feature in sequence, right? At one period of time, they code one thing, and another period of time, they code the other thing.
No.
Or are they more multiplexing?
No, it could be overlapped too. So you could have for instance, in the result that I presented about the transformation from goal in memory to the action, there you see that some neurons code the goal before at the same time as the action. So they overlap. They have a bit of delay. But during some period, both things are coded by the same neuron.
But no, if they switch their representational connotation, do you see that also as reflecting the progression of the decision making? Like, initially I have to make up my mind of what are my options, what's the relevant evidence, what's memory telling me. So at that point in time, you want to dedicate more representational resource to what's the goal I'm pursuing. But maybe at some point when you have pruned down your options and you say, okay, to achieve the goal, this is now my action, or these are the subset of actions I should consider. Maybe that in the progression of the decision process, I might want to shift my representational resource. Is that also how you see that?
Yeah, if I understood it correctly, we found it like a sequence of states. So first you have something in memory, and because you are integrating more and more information, now I should see which action to perform. So neurons are switching the tuning or the firing rate towards that feature because it's the one which is most relevant at that point. So it's more like a sequentiality of states. Actually, there are some works done with Hilleman model that what they saw is actually that we have sequences of states through which the neural population in the prefrontal cortex and also other cortical areas goes through sequences of states, so that they are adapting to the new events or new features coming in.
But does it reflect only that new information comes in, or does it also reflect the progression of the decision-making process?
And both, also the progression of the decision-making process. You can have changes in the states as the decision is being made, and also because you're integrating also new information. So both cases would be possible.
Right, but so most of your neurons are in dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, right?
Yeah.
Do you think that this is a generic feature also if you go to medial frontal cortex, or would you feel it's really a more specialized property of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex?
Well, this I cannot respond like with a clear answer because we didn't look at that. My guess would be that you might find it also in other areas, not only the dorsolateral frontal cortex. I think it's most likely that the evolves of the brain have some changes.
Right. But so then in this further experiment, you started to focus more also on how populations of neurons are actually then tuning themselves to the task, right? And from that came also this idea that some populations are showing this progression in sort of a task-dependent way, and other populations do not show this progression, right? This is your when you show this, you had these groups of neurons that you were measuring from. Then you have the pre-go and post-go goal neurons, right? But some of those are actually switching their representational state, and others do not. Right? So how should I think about that? How should I interpret that? What does that mean? Also in the face of what we just discussed, that there is this sort of progression of decision making, the resource is reallocated in some sense. But should I look at this result as telling us that, okay, I have a bunch of neurons in the prefrontal cortex. In the end, they're multiplexing because across all these neurons, you will find that they represent all possible aspects of the task and all possible combinations of these aspects. This is roughly what it means, right? Some of these will then again switch what they represent, and others will not switch what they represent, right? So there's a fixed representational substrate, and others who more dynamically allocate themselves to that. So how should we interpret that? That there are these neurons that are stupid and not dynamic, and others are smarter and they're dynamic, or how do you interpret that?
How we interpret it is we have two kind of two main key features in the prefrontal cortex. One are composed by neurons, which are very stable in the environment, so they are keeping track of what is going on, also information which is important for something, for the decision, or for attention, or for whatever. So they are very stable and robust. And then we have a second group of neurons, which are flexible, because in the end, you cannot just stick to something and that's it. You need to be flexible to be able to perform an action or to list or to get more information or whatever. So these two dynamics are very important in the brain, because one is telling us, okay, this is the information we have. And the other is saying, okay, but now we need to move from that information. We need to do something. So the other ones, the ones which are shaping the whole network in the prefrontal cortex to say, okay, now is the time to perform an action.
Right. But would it be fair then to say that there's one set of neurons, let's say 50% of the population, gives you like a ground truth and said, this is what is out there in the world. This is what my needs are and my goals. And I'm not going to, this is the blackboard on which I'm going to operate now. And then you have another representational substrate or another set of neurons that then say, okay, now, if I want to come to a solution of this, these are the things I should be doing. So it sort of moves away from that ground truth and now starts to sort of prune, okay, but this is the specific cue that matters. And this is the specific thing I should be doing, and I should ignore the other stuff. Is this roughly how you would think about that?
Not exactly, because we are talking always about two groups of neurons, but these are two extremes. We believe that in the prefrontal cortex, we have a continuum group of neurons. So that means that it's not that all we have only a group of neurons which are very stable and then one which is very flexible, but that we have also something in the middle, so that goes from stability to flexibility. So when I talk about two groups, I'm always talking about distinct cases. But we believe that we have neurons doing things also in the middle range.
Okay, that is true, because indeed in your data you filtered quite a bit, right? Yeah. In the end, we only looked at the non-switchers or the switchers.
Exactly, because these were the streams of the model.
All right, so but it's interesting, right? Because it means in all cases, in some you represent all possible aspects of the task and all its combinations, but then also you represent all possible transformations of that over time. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. So you're really expanding the whole search space, actually.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, okay.
So, for instance, with our model, we actually fitted the data that we were looking at. But remember that were always looking at 1,000 neurons. And we are selecting a subpopulation of them because they are doing what we are looking at. But of course, we have many different groups of neurons and many neurons doing all of this stuff. So.
Right. Exactly. No, I understand. Okay, so we have a high dimensional representation of your task and its changes, right? So that you would believe there's a bit of a problem. Like, how do I now select among all these options? How do you see the selection then taking place? And this also, of course, brings us a little bit to the model that you built of this, right? So now I have this high dimensional space with all sort of combinations of features of the task. One is sort of constant, and the other is dynamically now, if you want, trying options and weighing them, right? So how do you see that?
Listening to the outside world.
So how do you see that process play out? How should I imagine that this actually can lead to even a decision? That it can converge to a decision on an action I should perform?
All these neurons.
Yeah, this whole process of it, this whole dynamical process that you measure from.
Well, they are I mean, I could see that as I mean, do you imagine that the neurons which are stable and not firing rate are keeping track of the information which might be important at that point? And you see the other group as the flexible group getting more information from outside, but also from our internal motivation, attention, and everything. And you see this as a coupled, connected areas and neurons inside the frontal cortex. As I showed in the presentation, just by connecting it with some excitation and inhibition, you could get this selection at the end, because with the flexibility of the neurons, what you get is that they decide in a way which part or which neurons will be responding next, which in the end will lead to the appropriate action to perform.
Mm-hmm. So you propose a model where you say, well, you can think about this as a system of competing pools of neurons that are dedicated to certain aspects of the task, let's say the goal that I pursue, right? Mm-hmm. Then these neurons have the capability to maintain the state, like a memory, it's a memory system, and they have the capability to rapidly switch, right? They have capability because they're bistable, right? By virtue of how they're wired, they can maintain multiple states and they can switch from one to the other. But now every pool is dedicated to one feature of the task, like a goal, mm-hmm. right? Or a cue or an action. Mm-hmm. And then you showed that you could then get this switching behavior by wiring these pools of neurons up in a sort of a smart way, mm-hmm. right? That if I get a non-specific excitation across all these pools of neurons, that I can now flip, that I can sort of go for QA or QB or response A or response B. Correct?
Yeah, correct.
Okay, cool. So and you demonstrated to us that this can work. But you demonstrated that in a very low dimensional space, because now we just looked at one cue, mm-hmm. right? But what we looked at earlier, or as we discussed it earlier in your physiology, you see that actually you code all the features of the task and all their combinations, and it's changing over time, mm-hmm. right? So how do you see that model then scale? Because not only every pool of neurons in your model is one of these, right? One of these cues or one of these cue combinations, right? So how do you see that scaling being feasible for your model?
Okay, so each pool is not exactly only one feature of the task, mm-hmm. because the pools that I showed in the presentation are actually modules of a network, and each module is composed by 8 group of excitatory neurons and 1 group of inhibitory neurons. So each of this group is responding to one, for instance, if they are coding the goal. So if it's a module dedicated to the goal, they would be coding 8 different goals. So each pool would be responsible for being selected for a different goal. And the same happens with the other module. So inside each module, we have already selectivity for 8 different different variables of the same feature. So I think it's very realistic to scale it up, because it would be taking the same with the model that I presented today. We already have many features covered. Like if each module is actually coding the 8 different variables of a goal. So it's not only red and blue, like in our task, they could also code green, yellow, till 8. So actually the model is already capable of explaining quite
so the scaling will become problematic when I start to add goals then. So you have the grouping around goals, that would be a key, a critical feature. Mm-hmm. Because as long as this population is linked to that goal, mm-hmm. I can capture the whole set.
If there are no more than 8 goals, we mm-hmm. can explain the data.
Okay.
That would be another mm-hmm. way of saying it. Yeah.
But the other thing that you can think of is that your model is a labeled line kind of model, right? Mm-hmm. So the synapses I get must be uniquely linked to some feature, right? Otherwise, the dynamics cannot work, mm-hmm. right? So it would also mean every neuron is dedicated to is sort of permanently dedicated to some aspect of a task. Mm-hmm. But isn't an important feature of a working memory system of prefrontal cortex that you can dynamically be allocated to any task? right? So how would that work? I have my pools of neurons, and now I'm doing a discrimination task, but maybe the next hour I have to do a navigation task, or I have to do an operant conditioning task, or whatever. I have to look at other kinds of problems, right? So how can you have this flexible allocation of the content, if you want, the semantics?
Well, I think this model could be pretty general because you just change what you learned with time, the new task, and then you change your synaptic connectivity between the modules or from the input that you get, and then you would have 4 different kinds of behavior with the same model.
Okay.
So I think monkeys were really well trained in this distance discrimination task, but if they would switch to a different task, I think this would be learned in the synaptic connections of the module, and then you would have the same dynamics that would be.
Okay.
But actually, what we wanted to do was, the whole view that I presented at the end was more like a proof of concept to say, okay, we have this if we have these heterogeneous neurons in the brain, as we think we have, we can really explain the data that we observe. So it's more like a proof of concept to say we have a brain, and we have had an area which is full of heterogeneity in the excitability of the neuron.
Right. So, but now the scaling along goals, if I have goals that are competing with each other, right? How would I account for that in this system? You have opposing goals.
Okay.
Or even goals that are contradictory.
Okay, so you would have a competition. So this is in the end is each module is an attractor network. So you would have within a module, you would have 2 pools which are stimulated, and then they would compete. And in the end, you will have one winning goal and one that would lead to the final execution.
Okay. So, but in this case, indeed, so it's like an attractor model. We're looking at firing rates of the model, right? And in some sense, you're interpreting or try to predict performance from the firing rate. But in the earlier work, a very influential paper on which you were the first author, you actually made the point that firing rate is not that informative about performance, right? And it's much more the variability of the responses that really matters if tasks get more complex.
Yeah.
Did you step away from that view? Are you back now more into the rate coding view of things? Or?
No, I'm very interested still in the variability, or which information we can extract from the variability. In this case, I didn't look, well, actually we did something with variability, but we calculated it by looking at the burst and pauses in our data, because in the models that we presented, we have the stable models are the ones which are very stable and they don't have variability or almost nothing, not variability in the firing rate. Whereas the ones which are more flexible have much more variability. And we tested that in the data, looking at the burst and pauses, and we found that actually we could, this prediction was right. What we don't have is any link with the behavior there, because we were not, actually, I tried to look at that, but we didn't have any good. In this type, the problem is that we don't have reaction time. So that's very limited, because whenever the targets appear, the monkey can perform the action because he already knows what to choose. So we didn't have reaction time, so we could not correlate it with variability or with any other measure of difficulty. So that's why in this study I didn't look at that, because I didn't have the possibilities. But I think variability, and we proved that also within the model, is very informative. It's one of the key features of this flexible model.
So are you saying with it that are you moving away from the standard model of distribution models of decision making? Because the standard view would be, look, I just integrate whatever information I get, usually it's perceptually evidence, until it hits threshold. Whoever hits threshold first is the winner. So how are you sort of moving away from that standard view on the decision-making process?
I think these standard models are very nice and they are very useful to actually to have some predictions about which behavior you might encounter. But I think they are not so good to understand, to really explain the dynamics of a network. So you have an intuition of what you would expect as an average activity, But with the diffusion model, you cannot know what would be the individual dynamics because they don't do predictions of that. So I think the models are okay, but they have their limitations. So we must know how to use them. So because I'm more interested in the individual dynamics, so to understand how neurons respond individually, I'm more interested in these cyclic neural models because there you can really account and explain what we observe.
Yeah, but still, the proponents of the rate coded diffusion models, it's also the memory potential, the firing rate of individual cells that are predictive of performance, right? Because I can see that the slope that reflects integration is correlated with, let's say, the direction times I get, or with the accuracy that I get, right? So the claim would be made.
Yeah, I know. But I think it's more of under my point of view, it's more the average of the population. I don't think you can explain that with a single neuron. I know that there are some people that say that you can, and you see that in the individual neurons. But there are also some recent papers that show that actually the ramping activity is an artifact of averaging different state activity with many neurons. So I don't think you can explain all the individual dynamics with that. I think you can have an intuition about the mean activity, but not really what the neurons.
But I could then still say, well, but maybe what matters is the population response, and as long as I can predict performance from the population response, I'm happy. I don't care what these single cells do because it's all averaging out. It's just noise.
Yeah, but then I would say then why do we have so many neurons? With one neuron wouldn't be enough.
I often feel like that. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think if we have so many neurons are coding in so many different ways because of something that I should be able to.
But wait, but then don't you sidestep the problem, because I can say, well, maybe I have all this variability in neurons, so the average has some stability or follows some distribution, and that average is then what really drives the behavior.
But you could say that, but I think, for instance, in the paper that we have together, which was so influential, we could prove that that's not always the case. So that the inactivity is not telling everything.
Well, that's the other point, of course, right? That maybe the point is, if you have a simple task, you have a simple code, and rates are great. But if the task gets more complex,
that could be
like
awesome.
discrimination, right, then you have to switch to a different coding model.
Maybe, but what is that simple? What is a simple task? Because in a way, everything is complex. Discrimination tasks. Yeah, what would you say?
Well, look, if I have a random motion display with predominant motion in one direction, I just integrate over this whole field. I just need the one big integrator. And okay, we'll go one direction or the other. I don't need to compare anything. I just integrate. And just do integrating motion, right? So that's a simple task.
That's it, yeah.
If I need to compare two stimuli, right, or I have to compare two time intervals, I already sort of demand more from my memory. I have to keep something in memory. I have to compare things.
Yeah.
Right? So this might be another argument. Why?
Yeah, but still, I think, But I think we are much more optimal than that. So why would you have so many neurons doing the same if you could have just one doing that? I don't think because in the end it's energy that we should not.
That's true. Well, redundancy.
Yeah.
Or you could also argue, well, another perspective is, of course, it goes into the simple task. But if it's a simple task, you have simple cues, one cue. But if you look at the world in which these brains evolve, everything is ambiguous, predictability is an issue, the Markovian assumption doesn't hold, right? The future might be somewhat different from the past. You have, right? So maybe if we have these highly controlled and reduced paradigms, it of course also leads to a very reduced perspective on the complexity of the system that we are dealing with. Right? So maybe and then you are in something already moving a bit in a different direction. But there's always a question, do you want to still park it inside the standard model, right? Or do you want to move away from this idea that firing rates integration explains everything?
Yeah, no, I actually would like to move to. I mean, it's not that I don't agree with these models. As I say, they can be useful for some things, but I think they have their limitations. And it's better that we open to different options and that we really try to understand the individual dynamic.
Right. No, that's great. So, Encarni, you, of course, also then a delayed full disclosure. You've been a member of SPECS here, right? So we've been working together for quite a while. We mainly looked at models, right, of the brain. Then you went into neurophysiology of the non-human primate and macaques with Aldo Genovesio. And now you start to stand on your own legs at the Neuroscience Institute in Alicante, right? So you've made this tour now. You're sort of a young researcher. You're building your career. But given your experience, what would be Encarni's law and that we should follow to understand the brain?
Encarni's law.
Mm-hmm.
That that is fundamental to use a combined experimental and theoretical approach. Because I think with only experiments we cannot understand the brain because we have only observations. And with observation it's okay, but we don't know about the insights. And with the theory we can really explain that. But theory alone would be also not so good because then we don't have anything to prove that what we are saying is actually correct. So for me and in my future life, I would like to continue combining both because I think that both are fundamental for us to advance in understanding.
Okay, great. And then I will come down to Alicante in a few years from now to check the state of the art in your lab and to see whether you manage to really falsify or verify the key hypothesis. So what's the key hypothesis that you would like to see tested in this time frame of 4 years?
One that I'm still really willing to show since I ended my PhD actually is that the variability in the firing rate of the neurons are causing the uncertainty of the different sensory modalities, and that this is read out by a second state process, which is actually computing the confidence based on this diverse uncertainty that is coded in the firing rate, in the variability of the firing rate of the neurons.
Right.
So this is the key thing where I would like to continue and to build and I hope that in some years from now, I will have an answer to that and I can really prove that
Right.
that variability is very, very important. It's not only about the firing rate and that we should start looking at different things there.
Fantastic. Encarni Marcos, thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you to you.
The CSN podcast was produced by the Convergent Science Network of Biomimetics and Biohybrid Systems, a project funded by the European 7th Research Framework Programme. For more interviews, recorded lectures, or upcoming conferences in the field of biomimetics and biohybrid systems, go to csnnetwork.eu. And thank you for listening.